On this episode of Faith in Focus, we're going to be finishing chapter 3 in the book of James. We're going to be looking at the centrality of wisdom when it comes to maturity in the Christian faith. What godly maturity and wisdom looks like versus earthly, or what James calls demonic wisdom and maturity. And we might shade a little bit into chapter 4 if we have time. So that's what we're going to be looking at on this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. Well, I hope you had a great holiday season, a great Christmas, New Year. Mine, unfortunately, was racked with pretty bad cold, whatever's going around. Everyone seems to be getting it at certain times and certain severities, and I had this pretty lingering cough and sore throat through Christmas, so we had to delay celebrating Christmas. And I still have a lingering cough. My throat's fine, but so we'll see if I can make it through 25, 30 minutes of teaching uninterrupted without going into a coughing fit. If I do, there may be lots of cuts and edits to this episode, but we'll see. But either way, I hope you had an enjoyable holiday season, and that's part of the reason too why we're getting started so late up until this week of the new year. I didn't feel like I could probably talk for 30 minutes non-stop, but we'll see if I'm able to now. Eventually, we gotta just take that step of faith and see if we can do it. And like I said, if not, there's just going to be a lot of cuts and edits to this video. But just to recap what we've looked at since it's been a little while, the book of James is really a letter about how to mature as a Christian, and specifically how to mature in the midst of trials. James is writing to his audience of Jewish Christians, so these are people who are ethnically Jewish and religiously Jewish, but have accepted Christ as the Messiah. And this is fairly early in the history of the church. We're probably within 3-4 years, this is my guess, of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. We know Paul had to have come to faith within a couple years of the resurrection of Christ. And we know Paul was still not a believer when Stephen was stoned in Acts chapter 8. Paul was right there giving hearty approval of what was going on. He was a part of that. And that really was the impetus, that persecution of Stephen, to scatter the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea throughout the Roman Empire. So James, who was a leader in the Jerusalem church, has now lost his congregation. They've all been flung out into the Gentile world. And I have to imagine he probably wrote this letter fairly quickly. I made this case in one of the first teachings on this book. Just to put yourself in James's shoes, if you have these beloved people in your church in Jerusalem, and now they've been persecuted and scattered throughout the world, and you know they're suffering, maybe you're hearing reports of specific instances of how they're suffering, and you're thinking, wow, they really seem to be struggling. I'm going to wait 10, 15 years before I write a letter to them. Well, no, you would want to get a letter to them probably as quick as possible. So you have to imagine if we're a couple years from the resurrection of Christ, maybe a year or two has passed where people are out in the Gentile world and reports are coming back to James. He's probably writing fairly quickly. So we're probably looking at, 35, 36, 37 AD. That's where I would peg probably this time period. And another reason why most people agree it's fairly early is because I don't want to say it's unsophisticated in that it's one of my favorite books of the New Testament. So I don't mean that in a negative sense, but it's unsophisticated in the sense of using language that we as Christians might be familiar with. Things like grace, or walking in the Spirit, or being dead to the law, or certain things that most of our language that we use as Christians, whether we realize it or not, is really influenced by the Apostle Paul. And of course that makes sense. He wrote the bulk of the New Testament, and most of the New Testament epistles that we read as Christians are written by Paul. So a lot of the way he speaks and the way he thinks informs the way we think and understand things. But we have to understand that James is a different person. He certainly would not have been informed by the thinking of Paul, because Paul wasn't even a Christian when Stephen was stoned, and they probably have maybe only met a couple times, but Paul's not out preaching the gospel yet, doing his missionary journey. So it's a very unrefined in that sense, and some people often call it a very Jewish letter. And what that means is it doesn't have a lot of language that we would relate to as Gentile Christians. It much more sounds like he's pulling from the teachings of Jesus, which would make sense. That's probably a lot of what they had was the teachings of Jesus. And we'll see even some of the language he uses here in chapter 3, we'll look at with wisdom. He uses language that Jesus uses when speaking to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. And I think he's probably pulling from that concept of above or heavenly versus earthly. And so he's writing to his congregation, and he's realizing that they're struggling because they're suffering. And so all of these problems are starting to crop up. They're starting to favor the rich and the wealthy, and they're oppressing the poor, and they're maybe viewing the poor with contempt. Maybe they're turning inward, so they're not engaging in good works, because when you're struggling just to survive, and specifically if you're being persecuted by Gentiles and your fellow Jews who maybe aren't believers in the Messiah, you're being persecuted left and right, the natural inclination is to turn inward, to look to yourself, and but really serving is a means of growth. We see that in chapter 2. By giving out and actually put feet to your faith and doing something, it can actually strengthen and grow your faith. So James is wanting them to not turn inward, to not pull away from the world, but rather to continue to give out. And he also has alluded to this idea of asking God for wisdom. When you're suffering, you often ask why. When other people are suffering, when you're looking at suffering out in the world, that's the most common question. Why is this happening? Why has God allowed this to happen? What does God want me to learn? I mean, there's so many whys and whats and hows and whos, and what we're expressing is a lack of understanding. And James has already said, if you're lacking understanding when you're suffering, you can ask God for wisdom, and he'll give it to you. But he didn't really elaborate too much on that. And then in chapter 3, he talked about the tongue, the things that we say. A sin of speech really seems to be something that James is wanting to crack down on amongst his people. Saying things but not doing them, saying the wrong things, saying things that aren't encouraging, insulting, demeaning. Again, it's easy to do when you're suffering. Tensions are high, and you just want to snap at somebody and use your tongue to destroy somebody. If you're like me, I get in trouble more often from things that I say or post on social media than things that I do often. But we ended, though, in James chapter 3, verse 12. And he ends with, "Can a fig tree produce olives, my brothers and sisters? Or a vine produce figs? Neither can a saltwater spring produce fresh water." So he's talking about the incongruity between, okay, if you're a Christian and a follower of the Messiah, you can praise God with your lips, but then you can curse people who's made in their image. That seems to be an inconsistency. Things should not be that way. We shouldn't be pouring out bitter water from the same opening that brings blessings. So then he delves into wisdom, because, and this really, when I say that wisdom is the central point of maturity, it literally is kind of the central point of James's letter, which seems to be all about maturity and growing in a suffering, in circumstances where you're suffering. Wisdom, this topic of wisdom, is literally at the center of his letter, and he's I think readdressing an issue that he's brought up earlier when he talks about asking God for wisdom, and he'll grant it to you. He didn't really elaborate it too much at that point. He just said, ask God for wisdom. Well, of course, that seems kind of subjective, right? I mean, it's, you could ask God for wisdom, and then oftentimes if you're anything like me, and I do hear this a lot too from other Christians, so you probably are a lot like me, you might ask God for wisdom. You might ask God for direction. And then you get maybe a flash of insight. It's like, oh, this is what I should do, or this is the decision I should make, or this is what I should say to that person, or whatever. I should take this job or that, whatever it might be. We're asking God for wisdom, and then we get this insight, and then we doubt that. We think, is that really from God, or was that from Satan, or was that from me, or is that just my own thinking, or is that maybe my culture informing certain things? And then we question the insight, and then we say, okay, God, give me insight on my insight, and then we question that. Well, this is also, James says, hey, if you're asking God for wisdom and you get insight and wisdom, you should maybe trust that that's God giving you wisdom. But there is an element to where it could seem kind of subjective. How do I know whether this is really from God? And so James is going to elaborate a little bit more on it. He's going to unpack what wisdom looks like. Now, again, he's addressing people who are struggling. They obviously are misusing their tongue, they're favoring certain people, they're showing partiality. Maybe there's violence associated. There's a passage in James where he talks about violence and murder. It's near the beginning of chapter 4. And people think, oh, he must just be talking, in an exaggerated language, because Christians surely could not be violent or murder people or kill people. And you just think, well, I don't know that that's accurate. There's nothing stopping a Christian from committing violence against somebody else. Sometimes we might look out and say it's justified. If you think of like a Dietrich Bonhoeffer, trying to kill Hitler sort of thing, people think that was justified. But, I can't necessarily say that Christians don't commit violence. And if you commit violence, there's a good chance you're going to kill somebody. And the Jews had that sect, the Zealots, right? Even one of Jesus' disciples, Simon the Zealot, not Simon Peter, but Simon the Zealot. Zealots were assassins. They were mercenaries. They were murderers. They were terrorists. So obviously Christ can change that in a person. But if that's a person's background, they're out of the thousands of people that were in Jerusalem that accepted the Messiah, were there some of them that were zealots? Yeah. And did that past go away? Maybe not. Maybe when they're out in the Gentile world and they're being persecuted and they're thinking, man, I got to feed my family. I got to do something. Maybe they revert to old ways. And so maybe James is not being hyperbolic. Maybe he's speaking about something that's really going on. So all that to say, there's these people that are struggling and they don't know the right course of action. And so maybe striking out in violence, maybe that's the right course of action. And so what we really need is wisdom, but we need wisdom that is guided by a parameters. We're not allowed to just decide what we think wisdom looks like, because if we do, we think wisdom might be, shanking somebody to get a loaf of bread to feed my family. That's probably not biblical wisdom. So jumping into 13, he's gonna explain to us and differentiate between what he calls earthly wisdom or wisdom from above. So he says in chapter 3, verse 13, "Who is wise and understanding among you? By his good conduct he should show his works done in the gentleness that wisdom brings." So this was probably something, again, that they were a temptation that they were falling into. So I already said at the beginning of chapter 3, don't let many of you become teachers, because, teachers are going to be judged more harshly. So this position of the rabbi, the position of the community leader, this would have been something that the Jews did. Even, ethnic Jews, if they weren't believers in the Messiah, if they were in the Gentile world, they would come together as Jews and they would try to establish a synagogue, a pillar for this community of Jewish people. So it makes sense that these Messianic Jews, if they're being rejected by the Jewish community and the Gentiles, they would try to form something similar. Well, of course, if you're all suffering, people are going to be jockeying for power, and you're going to want that authority. And James is saying, hold on, first of all, understand you're taking on a pretty lofty position at that point. You're going to be judged more harshly. But also he says, hey, who's wise and among you by his good works, by his good conduct, he should show his works done in the gentleness that wisdom brings. So if you're gonna step in the role of leader, you might be saying, hey, I'm the smartest, I've got the most insight, I've got the most knowledge, I've got the most wisdom. And James is saying, hey, talk is cheap. We've already talked about the danger of the tongue. We're very inconsistent with the way we speak. We bless and curse from the same mouth. So just because somebody says, hey, I'm wise, I'm knowledgeable, I've got all this understanding, talk is cheap. So look at their life and look to see, what is their conduct saying? Later when Paul talks about appointing elders and leaders in the church, these are the kinds of things he's looking for. He's not looking for, if you look through the qualifications to be an elder in a church or a deacon, probably the closest thing that might come to something that our world would consider knowledge or wisdom would be something like able to teach. They're able to teach the Word of God. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to teach it well. There are people who maybe aren't articulate but can teach the Word of God very well. Maybe they don't do it in a setting where they can stand in front of people and teach. Maybe they're not articulate and they can't, 3 points in a joke, in a application and all. Maybe they can't systematize it that way. but that doesn't mean they can't teach. So that's probably the closest thing that might come to like a skill that the world would look at and say, "Ooh, this person is. We really need to put this person in leadership." Paul would say, "No, let's look at their character qualities. Are they stable in their marriage? Are their kids following the Lord? Do they fight a lot, or are they peaceable? Are they drunk, or do they have control over their faculties? Are they insane, or do they have a good head on their shoulder?" Certain mature qualities, those are the kinds of people that we want to put in church leadership. So James is saying something similar. Hold on. Just because somebody says that they're wise, look at their life. And another thing Paul would say, some people's deeds go before them and some show up after. And his point is, hey, Timothy, if you're looking at people and you think, oh, wow, this person, they've got a lot of really good works. Let's put them into leadership. Paul's saying, hold on, they may have hidden sin that's going to show up later. Some people, their sin's just right out front. You might think, okay, this person needs to grow a little bit before we give them the position of leader or teacher or something. So, okay, let's let them grow. But some people, we might just be prone to look at immediately what we see and immediately lay hands on them. So this is why Paul would say, right, don't lay hands on somebody too quickly because, hey, they might have sins that are going to show up later. Give them time. We don't need to be in a rush about this thing. So, who's wise among you? By his conduct he should show his works in the gentleness that wisdom brings. So it really is this Hebrew idea, if you read the book of Proverbs, which is all about wisdom and foolishness. But then when you read through the Proverbs, it's all about behavior, right? It's not a whole lot about intellectual stuff. I mean, there's some of that stuff in there, but wisdom really much more is about the things that you do. If you're somebody who works hard, if you're somebody who saves, if you're somebody who, fears the Lord, if you're somebody who can control their tongue, you're a wise person, according to the book of Proverbs. And James would say the same. Just because you say you're wise, you might be wise according to the world's standards, but that's not the same standards we should have as Christians. This is part of holiness, right? Holiness means to be separate and different. This doesn't just mean we wear different clothes or we eat different food or we go to church on Sunday instead of sleep in or whatever things that we might think, oh, that's what makes us Christians. That's not what holiness means. Holiness means separate or different. So how are we different? Well, we're different in regards to their leaders, the Gentiles, Jesus said, lord it over their people. So there's this domineering dictatorship, this authoritarian mindset. I'm the best. I'm the leader. Listen to me. Whereas James, Jesus, and the New Testament would teach, no. Who's wise? The humble person, the person who doesn't necessarily have the most to say, that might be the person we need to look at. If you've been a listener of Faith and Focus for a while, I would encourage you to become a supporter of the ministry by becoming a monthly donor. Your generous donations allow me to continue working within Faith and recording new content. You can find a link to my donation page in the show notes for this episode. Thank you. He says in verse 14, "But if you have bitter jealousy and selfishness in your hearts, do not boast and tell lies against the truth. Such wisdom does not come from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. For where there is jealousy and selfishness, there is disorder and every evil practice." So, James is now getting into what negative wisdom might look like. If you have bitter jealousy and selfishness. Okay, well, these are natural human emotions. Bitter jealousy. If you're suffering, the cheap way to get out of suffering and to make yourself feel better is envy and jealousy. And right, this is kind of a problem that we have in our culture today. Some people don't do as well as other people. The classic example is used like me wanting to compete against LeBron James. Is it fair that LeBron James gets paid millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars to play basketball, and I can't play basketball, and I'm not making millions of dollars? That doesn't seem fair. Well, okay, that might not be fair. And if you take that situation and multiply it, and he's now a billionaire, and maybe I'm living in abject poverty, which I'm not. I mean, Sometimes I think I am, but I'm not obviously living in abject poverty. But if somebody is suffering and they're at the point of starvation, and you've got LeBron James who can play basketball and make millions of dollars, that person might think, this isn't fair. I'm suffering. And so then they become jealous of LeBron James. So it's not a, what can I do to change myself? Now, if I was like, man, LeBron James is really good at basketball and I want to make millions of dollars playing basketball, maybe I could do things to change. I mean, I highly doubt it. I mean, let's just be realistic. There's certain things I'm never going to do. But maybe there are things that I can change about myself to improve myself. So that's, again, a mature way to look at things. If James is concerned about us maturing as Christians and meeting that teleos, that perfection that he's talked about, this is what God has intended us to be. You know, first of all, God may not intend me to be LeBron James. God intends me to be me, and for me to be conformed into the image of Christ. So if LeBron James was to be conformed into the image of Christ, it's not going to look the same way as I would. So jealousy really doesn't make any sense. I'm jealous over somebody that I will never be, I could never be, no matter how much I change or try. I'm not going to be that person. So I have to deal the hand that I'm dealt. So this is something that I really think is important for us as Christians to understand. This goes to, again, part of holiness and being different than the world. That might be how the world thinks. The world might think, I can be anything that I want to be, and I can do anything that I want to do. You know, if you still believe that as an adult, I'm sorry, you're pretty naive. You can't be anything that you want to be. And you know, I don't want to be too political or insensitive, but you know, this is at the heart of this madness that's going on in our world today, where people think that they can change genders into another gender. I'm jealous and envious of the fact that whatever, you know, women can do X, Y, and Z, or men can do X, Y, and Z. So I can do anything that I want to do. And by golly, I am going to change reality to fit what I want. My bitterness and my jealousy of what that person has, or that the place that person has in the world, is driving me to foolishness, and it's not leading towards flourishing. It's leading towards degradation and sin. You're going to miss the mark of what God has for you because you're not living in reality. So this bitter jealousy and selfishness, these are mentalities that we just have to dispense with as Christians. You know, in the book of Hebrews, we're told, do not let any root of bitterness crop up within your Christian community. It will stunt any growth in a community, because then you start competing with each other rather than working together as a body in a group of Christians. So the selfishness, bitterness, that has to be done away with. If a person says, you know, hey, I'm wise, but you see that bitterness and envy and selfishness is at the root of their mentality, that person has something that I want and I'm going to do whatever I can do to get it. That is not wisdom. It may be earthly wisdom. It's not wisdom from above. And so he goes on to say, if you have bitter jealousy, selfishness in your hearts, do not boast, tell lies against the truth. Such wisdom does not come from above, but is earthly, natural, demonic. So these kind of three descriptors of what this wisdom really actually looks like. And again, we might think, it's just earthly wisdom. So maybe it's not as good as heavenly wisdom, but there's still some value to it. He's like, no, it's natural. It's demonic. It's kind of like when he says, you know, your tongue is set on fire by hell. I mean, he's going 2:11, right? So this wisdom is actually fueled by Satan, which makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, it makes sense that that's how he would describe it, because what was Satan's motivation? I mean, it was jealousy. He was jealous of God. He was envious of the glory that God had. He was selfish. He wanted that glory for himself. He's envious of the glory that God has and the glory that he's showing and the love that he's showing towards humanity. Everything that Satan does is motivated by this jealousy, this pride, this envy, this selfishness. And so James is using this language, such wisdom does not come from above, but is earthly. And this is the same exact language Jesus used when speaking to Nicodemus. He talked about, hey, you've been born from below of the earth. You need to be born again. You need to, and really, it's unclear whether he means born again or born from above, but I mean, it really doesn't ultimately matter. If you've been born from below and then you're born from above, that's a second birth and you've been born again. So, not necessarily trying to take away the born again language, but really it's this born from above. It's this heavenly birth, this birth that comes from the Spirit, from God. So, wisdom that looks like this, that is characterized by this, that's earthly wisdom. That's demonic wisdom. Where there's jealousy and selfishness, there's disorder and every evil practice. So, man, in terms of Christian community, again, disorder, jealousy, selfishness, these are like the anti-fruits of the Spirit. When you look at the fruit of the Spirit, these things like wisdom and gentleness and peace and kindness and love, these are all fruits that are done with other people. I mean, you can't be gentle. I mean, I guess in theory you could be gentle to yourself. You maybe not be so hard on yourself when you make mistakes, but really gentleness and peace and patience, these are fruits that are exhibited when you're dealing with other people. So these are attributes that we want to see in community. So we want wisdom. We want the spirit of wisdom to be driving our growth and maturity. And we should know when we start to see things break down. Okay, hold on. We're having division. There's division going on in our church, or our Bible study, or our community, whatever it might be. There's division going on. What's at the heart of this? Oh, we're being driven by wisdom. We've got selfishness going on. We've got bitterness. We've got envy. All of these things are at the heart of what's going on. So, he talks about you've got bitter jealousy and selfishness in your hearts. This would be an example, I think, of James using language not quite the way Paul would use it. Paul seems to talk about, if we think of our heart, sometimes we think of that as our innermost being, the core of who we are. And Paul seems to be very careful when he talks about that part of us, what really is our spirit. He seems to definitely be trying to make us understand that as Christians, under the new covenant, our heart of stone has been taken out of us and our heart of flesh has been implanted in us. So that new nature, maybe we would call it, that new spirit dwelling within us. Christ's spirit becoming one spirit with ours. In Romans 7, when he says, the things that I don't want to do, I do. So he's saying, I don't want to do those things. So me, the real Dennis, doesn't want to do these things. That's my spirit. That's my new man. That's my new heart. So in that sense, my new heart is not full of jealousness and envy and bitterness. My new heart, it wants to do good and it wants to love. But heart, like any word, we've talked about saved and justified. Words have a broad range of meaning. So a heart can literally just mean your physical heart. So, I mean, think about how foolish it would be if your doctor was to say, hey, listen, you have a bad heart. You've had too many heart attacks. And your heart is, you've got heart disease. And you were to say, nope, I don't have heart disease. I've got a new heart given to me from Jesus. It's like, okay, you can think that all you want, but your physical heart's going to fail. You're going to die. So, obviously, words have a range of meaning. And part of the range of meaning would just be like your emotions. And of course, Christians have negative emotions. We might think of them as thoughts. Maybe they're coming from our mind. But this cardia, the Greek word for heart, just has this broad range of meaning that could mean how Paul uses it, could mean how your doctor means it when he says you got a bad heart, but it could just mean your emotions and probably your soul would be another way to describe it. So it's kind of this broad range of meaning. So he's probably not using it the way Paul would use it. So I just wanted to throw that in there. We as Christians still have these emotions, this jealousness, selfishness. Those things are still there. They're part of the flesh, and we're not going to get rid of the flesh until we die. So where there's jealousy and selfishness, there's disorder and every evil practice. And then he gives out what wisdom from above looks like. He says, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, accommodating, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial, and not hypocritical. So you kind of look at these and kind of line them up probably with the fruit of the Spirit. He's really just describing the fruit of the Spirit. Of course, Paul would not list the fruit of the Spirit, and that's obviously not an exhaustive list of the fruit of the Spirit. He's just probably giving descriptors of, he's thinking about the character of Christ and describing him in certain adjectives. So here's some other adjectives of what wisdom from above looks like. So the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So as we're pursuing the Lord and we're gaining wisdom, that wisdom is what causes us to grow in maturity. Maturity in the Christian life is probably akin to what Proverbs talks about wisdom. Wisdom looks like this and this and this, good behavior, godliness, that sort of thing. So we as Christians would say, hey, you know what? Maturity looks like conformity to Christ and who Christ has made us to be. That teleos, right? That maturity that God is growing us towards. Wisdom is moving towards that, so it's characterized by certain things along that path. It's first pure. So that right there kind of strips away, motives. If your motives are one of like self-serving, to get one up on somebody else, to jockey for a position, to be first, to be head, to be the teacher, to be the leader, if your position is to put people down, is whatever it might be, that's not pure. So right out of the gate, you're not going to get godly wisdom or maturity if right out of the gate your wisdom is not pure, and it's not peaceable or gentle or accommodating. So these different descriptors, what I think is significant is this is what kind of gives us our guardrails, right? To know and to diagnose ourselves, but also I think other people when we as Christians are called upon to follow wise leaders and to follow wisdom and to listen to wisdom. But sometimes we're susceptible to say, I don't really know. How can I know if this person's wise? It seems wise, and I think because we follow the world's way of thinking more than we should, I think a lot of the times we buy into the world's way of thinking, which doesn't seem overtly sinful. A lot of the times the world operates on a very pragmatic level. So anything that we have to do to accomplish the goal, to accomplish the mission, to accomplish the purpose, whatever our church is, our church, what we want to do is our church's mission is to reach the lost. I mean, that's an admirable goal. That is what we're here to do. But if in going about doing that, we're mistreating people, very type A type person, where it's just like the mission must go on, and if you can't keep up, we're going to bowl over you and blow you out of the way, and you can just maybe literally go to hell. Maybe that's our mentality. You can get out and go someplace else. We don't want anything to do with you if you're going to be slowing us down. And it's all mission focused. It's focused on the prize. It's focused on winning people for Christ. But you're completely demolishing people. It's first pure, then peaceable, gentle, accommodating. You can look at that and say, man, the ends don't justify the means in Christianity. If you are trying to get to the goal of Christian maturity, but going through the path of worldly wisdom, you're not going to reach godly maturity. And that's very hard for us to accept, because sometimes the world's way of doing things might get the job done, so to speak, a whole lot faster. But it was going to leave a lot of dead bodies in our wake. It's going to leave people who've just been abused and abandoned. That's not what God would have for us. So we can look at leaders, and it's like, man, if they really seem to be exhibiting that first half, this jealousy, selfish ambition, hypocrisy, man, maybe that's a evil practice. Yeah, maybe that's not who we should follow. This Hillsong documentary that came out, I think last year, Hillsong Exposed, talked about the high up leaders in Hillsong. And, he talks, the Carl Lentz, he, thousands of people are coming to Hillsong in New York City. By all accounts, he's like, man, he seems like the right guy. He seems like everyone should be following this guy because he's doing the right thing. But you look at it and you just think, this guy's wearing like $10,000 hoodies. This guy's wearing, thousands of dollars worth of clothing. This doesn't seem... You just think, I can't put my finger on this. But something just doesn't seem right about this. This seems like selfishness. I mean, how could you not be selfish if that's the way you dress? With all of the needs that there are in New York City, and you're going to spend $10,000 on a hoodie, that seems selfish. So no matter what his goal might be, it's being pursued in wisdom that is earthly, natural, and demonic. It's not going to lead to maturity. It's going to lead to, it really ended in disaster for that guy. So that's not the people we should be following. That's not the people we should want to be emulating. We want to surround ourselves with people who are first pure, then peaceable, and that's what we should be striving for. And he says, to wrap out chapter 3, he says, the fruit that consists of righteousness is planted in peace among those who make peace. It's kind of a weird little saying, but what I think he's saying is, if we as Christians want to reap this harvest of righteousness, if you want to get righteousness from the righteousness tree, a fruit of righteousness, which is what we want, right? We maybe want righteousness for ourselves. We want to grow in righteousness. We want to grow in understanding. We want it for other people. We want people to come to know Christ and to, as the book of 2 Corinthians says, he who knew no sin became sin on our behalf so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. We want people to understand that. They want for Christ to take their sins and them to get God's righteousness. That's what we want. That's the fruit that we want to see. If that's the fruit you want to see, you can't plant in earthly wisdom. You can't plant bitterness, envy, strife, and expect to get this harvest or fruit of righteousness. This fruit of righteousness is planted in peace. The wisdom from above is pure then peaceable. You've got to start with the seed of godly wisdom that comes from above. And then it's planted among those who make peace. So I think not only is it the method and the mentality of what's driving maybe our walk with God, but it's done amongst a community of people who have a similar mindset. And then we might see this crop of righteousness grow up. Our group will become more Christ-like. Our group will become more mature. We will start to see righteousness lived out in our group. And maybe, Lord willing, we might even see a crop of righteousness from the world as people come to faith in Christ more and more. But it has to first start with godly wisdom. So that's chapter 3, diagnosing godly wisdom and wisdom from above versus wisdom from below. Hope you enjoyed this episode. Have a good one. While Faith in Focus is a ministry of InFaith, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of InFaith as a mission.